welcome back. What are we doing today? Okay, more macro. Not starting with a clicker question, just to throw you off, since you're used to having a clicker question first. I thought I'd just be different today. Starting with a little clarification. As you read in the news and so on about economic growth, it's important to know that there are several different definitions of economic growth, and so you always have to read for context. Mariko, I feel like I'm up a little bit too loud. So it's important to read for context when you're reading something that's talking about economic growth, because economic growth can mean one of three things. It can mean long-run increases in potential GDP, that is to say a shift out of the production possibilities frontier. So something that occurs because of an increase in the quantity of inputs or an increase in the productivity of inputs. That's one way in which people use the phrase economic growth. A second way in which people use the phrase economic growth is to look at what actually happens to GDP and say there's economic growth if there are increases, excuse me, over the long run, that is decade to decade or generation to generation, in what's happening with the amount of output that's produced. A third way in which people use the same phrase, so there's one phrase has three different meanings, which is why you have to read for context, is to refer to short-run increases in actual GDP. So people will also use the phrase economic growth to refer to the fact that the economy has grown or is larger today than it was at the bottom of the current business cycle, that is in January of 2009. So there's those three different definitions. You just have to read for context. So when you're reading some article about economic growth, you just have to read context and see what are they talking about. Are they talking about increases in potential GDP? That's what we talked about in September. Are they talking about long-run increases in actual GDP? That's a focus oftentimes of economic history. Are they talking about what's been happening over the last year or so? Oftentimes a focus of macroeconomics. So just a little tip. No clicker question, but a tip instead. Okay, so we had our little overview of macroeconomics on Monday. Macroeconomics concerns itself with long-run economic growth in the sense of increases in the production possibilities frontier. We've already done that topic. That's what we did in September, so we get to move on to topic 2. Topic 2 is unemployment. Topic 3 is inflation. I asked you a clicker question at the end of Monday about what do you think most people care about, and 90% of you said either unemployment alone or unemployment in combination with something else. That's the reason that we spend most of our time talking about issues relating to unemployment and trying to answer the question of what determines the unemployment rate. In order to answer any question, remember we use economic models, and so this slide is a review of what we had earlier in the semester. Remember that models are how economists answer questions, that each model is characterized by three things. A question, in the first case, is going to be what determines unemployment. Simplifications or abstractions, we'll talk about those as we go along, and assumptions about economic behavior. Change any one of those three things, and you change the model. That is, you come to a different answer to the question. And remember what we said about the counterfactual. If we want to evaluate policy, so for instance, if we wanted to evaluate increase in government spending in 2009, we don't compare the past with the present. We compare the present with what would have been in the absence of policy. So we compare the policy's results with the counterfactual. That is, what result would have existed or would have been in the absence of policy. We don't compare it with the past. In order to formulate that counterfactual, we use the models. So that's what the models are for. They help us to understand how the economy works, so we can formulate those counterfactuals, so we can evaluate policy, so we can figure out if we're doing the right things or not. Which means that having the right model to understand what's going on in the macroeconomy is really important. Macroeconomics is very different than microeconomics. Microeconomics has been taught the same way. You can pick that up at the end of class. Did you not hear me? Thank you. That was kind of clear. You can pick it up at the end of class. Somebody knows whose student that is, and we'll talk to him in section, I assume. Thank you. Anyway, it's important to have the right model. In microeconomics, the model has been the same since the 1890s. So they've been teaching that supply and demand stuff and all these other things that we did in microeconomics for over 100 years, and there hasn't really been any change. What you learned in microeconomics, aside from the examples that I did, the concepts, the models that we did, were the same as what people have been taught in this room for umpteen years. My dad took Econ 1 in this room in 1937. He would have been taught the exact same things that I taught you in terms of microeconomics. In terms of macroeconomics, there is not just one model. There's not just one story. There's not just one answer to the big questions of what determines unemployment and what determines inflation. These are open debates. These are things that we're still trying to decide upon, to figure out, to get a handle on. And so when we do macroeconomics, we're actually doing something very different than we were doing when we did microeconomics. Microeconomics is teaching you a set of tools that everybody agrees on. You had to learn the tools. Macroeconomics, you really have to wrap your head around the fact that what we're looking at are different answers, different proposed answers to the same question, what determines unemployment. And that whether or not a particular model is correct or right, may not be the right question. That what we're really looking at is what are the circumstances under which, what are the assumptions under which a particular model does a really relatively good job of describing the economy, and what are the circumstances or the assumptions under which a particular model, story, answer doesn't do a very good job of describing the economy. When people first started grappling with these big issues of high levels of unemployment was particularly in the 1930s, when we experienced the Great Depression here in the United States as well as around the world. The predominant thought in economics coming into the 1930s was the stuff I had taught you, was the micro stuff that had been developed in the 1890s. The asymmetric information part, that was more recent, but up until that moment. The supply and demand stuff that we did comes out of Marshallian economics that had been around since the 1890s. And so the model, the story, the answer that people tried to use in the early 1930s to understand why were economies experiencing such very, very high levels of unemployment, the models that they tried to use were models that came from those microeconomic tools that had been taught the same way since the 1890s and were the same as what we taught you. So with that model, what we have is, let's suppose there's one labor market. Now this turns out to be a not useful way of understanding, but it's helpful to look at it to start to get a sense of how do we think about all these things. The story in the, say, 1930s or so was, look, we've got supply and demand. We've got upward sloping supply, we've got downward sloping demand. So instead of looking at the market for 6-ounce cups of chocolate flavored frozen yogurt, let's look at the market for labor. Right? So let's suppose there is a labor market. And we can draw a picture, because we're good economists, right? We can draw a picture, and when we draw a picture of a market, we choose a color, any color. We put the price of labor on the vertical axis. Well, the price of labor, that's just the same thing as the wage. So I'll put down W for wage. Could be hourly, could be daily, doesn't really matter. And on the horizontal axis, we're going to put the quantity of labor, that is the number of workers, or worker days, or worker hours, depending upon how we're defining this. Those specifics don't really matter. And basing on what we did in the 1890s, we'd say there's some demand for labor, some downward sloping demand for labor. That demand for labor, chapter 9, derives from the marginal revenue product curve, and that represents the behavior of firms. So these are firms, they're employers who are looking for workers. The higher the wage, the fewer workers they'll want to hire because they need to maximize profit. And if they're going to maximize profit, they want the wage to be equal to the marginal revenue product, All of that results in a downward sloping demand for labor curve. Basic stuff, taught in the 1890s, picked it up in 1930. Let's see if it works. Upward sloping supply curve, supply of labor, those are the workers. And that's capturing that at a higher wage, people would want to work more. Heck, somebody's going to pay me $400 an hour. I'm more inclined to work for them than if they're going to pay me $4 an hour. So at a higher wage, people want to work more. At a lower wage, people want to work less. We've got some upward sloping supply curve. Bring it together. We've got equilibrium, where supply equals demand. Dash it over. We'll call it W star for the equilibrium wage. Dash it down. We'll call it Q star for the equilibrium quantity. If the wage in the market is that wage W star, then everybody who wants a job at that wage will be employed. Everybody who wants to hire a worker at that wage will be able to find a worker, and it'll be sweet. And then the implication of this model was that if we have unemployment, it must be the case that the wage is actually some wage, call it W1, that's above the equilibrium wage. Because if we had a wage W1 that was above the equilibrium wage, choose any wage, mark it W1, dash it over to your demand for labor curve, dash that down, that would be the quantity of labor demanded, the number of workers or worker hours that employers wanted to hire. Go back to W1 and keep dashing it over till you hit your supply curve, dash that down. That would be the quantity supplied. That would be the number of workers or worker hours, however we're measuring this, that would be willing and able to work at that wage of W1. The quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied. There's a gap there. When we did markets for like bottled water, we would say that was a market surplus. When we're talking about people, instead we say that's unemployment. If the number of workers who want to work is greater than the number of jobs, that's unemployment. And so the implication of this model, we just pick it up what we learned in the last few weeks, what was taught in the 1890s, is, hey, if there's an unemployment problem, it must be because wages are too high. The wage must be above the equilibrium wage. We could solve this unemployment problem. All we need to do is decrease wages. If employers would simply cut their workers' pay, if we lowered the wage down to W star, voila, we would no longer have 25% unemployment, which is what we had at the worst of the Great Depression. We wouldn't have an unemployment problem. Everything would be hunky-dory, and we could just go about our business. Well, okay, that's a model. It's a story. It's an answer to the question of what determines unemployment. But models. Question, assumptions and simplifications. No, wait, simplifications and abstractions, assumptions about economic behavior. Simplifications and abstractions. Well, what do we have here? If we have one model, one market for labor, remember what the assumptions are that lie behind our ability to tell a story using this model of perfect competition. We had to have lots and lots of firms selling a homogeneous product in a market in which there are no barriers to entry or exit. Well, in the case of the labor market, if we're trying to use this one model to understand the entire United States economy, we've just said that there is no difference, that one, let's say, person with a PhD in economics is indistinguishable from somebody who has a job in the booth at the gas station. That somebody with a PhD in economics and somebody who dropped out of high school are exactly the same. They're like zucchini. They're like zucchini. Pick them up, look at them, you can't tell where they came from. You can't distinguish one zucchini from another. You can't distinguish one person from another. In which case, there's absolutely no reason for you to be here, right? Because if workers are completely homogeneous, then what's the point in going to college? There's absolutely no point in going to college. So clearly that's a bad assumption, that we can't make the assumption of homogeneous workers, because workers are not homogeneous. There's huge differences. There's high-quality workers and low-quality workers. There's overeducated workers. There's undereducated workers. There's workers that have skills of this sort and not that sort, and vice versa. And so clearly the assumption of homogeneous, there we go, workers is a bad assumption. Well, once you drop that assumption of homogeneity, you can no longer use this model, this story, this graph, to answer the question of what determines unemployment, because it was based on that assumption of homogeneity of workers. Moreover, suppose we got fancy and we said, okay. What if I define this to be a particular labor market? What if I say, I'm going to look at the labor market for people who have PhDs in economics? I'm going to look at the labor market for people who have skills as plumbers. Okay, so we're going to do a specific labor market. Well, the next piece that they didn't know in the 1930s, but we certainly know now thanks to the work of George Akerlof and everybody who came behind him, the next piece is one of the other key assumptions that we had to use in order to talk about markets finding equilibrium was full information. There had to be full information between the buyers and the sellers. Well, labor markets are one of those markets where that assumption of full information really falls apart. That we have definite asymmetric information problems. In labor markets, we have both adverse selection and moral hazard problems. And the solution to both the adverse selection and the moral hazard problems seems to be for employers who are concerned about the quality of their workers to offer above market wages. That is, employers recognizing that there is asymmetric information, they don't know everything there is to know about the quality of their workers. If those are employers who care, that is to say, whose profit margin depends upon having high quality workers, if those are employers who care about the quality of their workers, they're going to offer a wage that's above the market equilibrium wage. Because when they offer a wage that's above the market equilibrium wage, they've got a better shot at first hiring and second retaining those high quality workers. And so the assumption of full information, which also lay behind this nice, pretty little 1890s model, is also not an assumption that applies to labor markets. So another reason, we didn't know that reason until the 1970s after George Akerlof had done his Nobel Prize-winning work, but we have that understanding now, that asymmetric information means that wages aren't going to fall to equilibrium, and trying to use this as a model to understand economy-wide unemployment might not help. Well, the bottom line of that whole, 5-minute rant that I just did is that having this picture actually doesn't help us. That saying unemployment is a result of too high of wage, while it is the correct conclusion if the assumptions of the model are satisfied, that is, if we have homogeneous workers, if we have full information, and so on, that conclusion that high wages result in unemployment is the right conclusion if those assumptions are satisfied. The whole point is that those assumptions aren't satisfied. That is not a good way to understand the macroeconomy, that is the aggregation of all of the players at once. Not only that, but looking just at the labor market is doing what economists call looking at a partial equilibrium as opposed to a general equilibrium. That we're looking only at one market, in this case the market for labor, but we're forgetting something important. For instance, if employers were to lower people's wages, then people would have less income. If people have less income, can they buy as much stuff? No. When people have less income, they can't buy as much stuff. And when people aren't buying as much stuff, be that stuff goods or services, when people aren't buying as much stuff, then there's not as much demand for the output of firms, and then firms don't need as many workers. And so the firms lay off workers because there was cuts in wages. And so when we start expanding beyond the labor market and seeing how the labor market piece fits into the whole scheme that we care about with macroeconomics, or what they call the more of a general equilibrium picture, we see that even if the assumptions were satisfied, even if there was homogeneity of workers, even if there was full information, this approach to understanding unemployment isn't going to help, because it says what you need to do to solve the unemployment problem is slash wages, cut what people are getting paid. It's not going to help. You cut what people are getting paid, they can't go shopping as much, there's not as much demand for what's produced, there's fewer jobs available, people lose their jobs. Oh my God, we're right back where we started with high unemployment. So for all of those reasons, this standard approach to understanding the macroeconomy, which is what people had in 1930, turns out not to be a useful approach. All right, clicker question. Now there's a clicker question. The model of, let me do that again. Push there, double clicked. The model of one labor market does not answer the question of what determines unemployment. Why not? A, the assumption of homogeneous workers is not satisfied. B, the assumption of full information is not satisfied. C, the conclusion of unemployment happens when the wage is above the equilibrium wage is wrong. Both A and B are all at A, B, and C. A, B, C, D, or E. That is A. What did she just say? It took her 15 minutes on one slide. What did she say? 3 seconds. 1, 2, and 3. All right, let me show you. So we're kind of split between A, B, and C. This is one of the reasons that I don't use multiple choice questions, because it's a very deliberately vague question. Depending upon how you interpret option C, it could be true or it could be false. So the conclusion that unemployment happens when, what does it say? When the wage is above the equilibrium wage is correct if the assumptions of the model are satisfied. So if we've got homogeneous workers, if we've got full information, if we've got whatever these other assumptions were satisfied, if they're all true, then that conclusion is correct. But if those assumptions of homogeneous workers, of full information, if those assumptions are not satisfied, then that conclusion doesn't necessarily hold. That the bottom line, the story that we tell, depends upon the assumptions that we make. So I was happy with either D or E. It would never be the kind of question I would write because I very deliberately made statement C vague. The statement C is true in some circumstances and not true in other circumstances. Depends upon what are the assumptions. What are we assuming to be true? Are the conditions satisfied or not? All right, so that's why the old story doesn't work. So let's look at the new story. And I better pick up the pace if I can't spend 15 minutes on each slide going forward. All right, so 1930-ish, we didn't have a very good answer. The answer we had was that unemployment was because wages were too high. The policy suggestion to firms was they ought to be cutting the wages of their workers. When firms did start cutting wages of their workers, the typical wage cut was a 10% wage cut, and what they found was that cutting the wages of their workers actually made the economy worse. So clearly, the policy prescription that came out of that wrong model was making things worse. John Maynard Keynes was a British economist, born in the early 1880s, could have been in the right century there. Born in the early 1880s. Where's my picture? There he is. Looked something like that. Was a friend of Virginia Woolf and other things. And he was a friend of Virginia Woolf, and there are other, never mind, that was a weird sentence. He was a friend of Virginia Woolf and other people, and he was a variety of things. He was interested in the arts and so on. I'm rambling. Let me go on. That's John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes said, trash the old, and let's think about this a new way. And he published a book that's called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. It's a pretty hard slog. You can try to read it. It's an interesting, if you're a real econ nerd, check it out and try to get your way through it. Maybe I would wait and do it in the summer, because it's written in 1930s language and it's not always 100% clear. But it's where he set forth the ideas that form the basis of the Keynesian model of macroeconomics, which is the basis of how most policy in the United States is conducted. So we're going to spend a lot of time on this model because if we want to understand the decisions that are being made at the Federal Reserve, if we want to understand the decisions being made at the level of the federal government, this is the model. This is the story about what determines unemployment that forms the basis for all of the policies. Here's what Keynes said. He said unemployment depends upon or is determined by employment. If we want to understand how much unemployment there is in the economy, that's the wrong question to ask. We need instead to ask what's determining the level of employment. If we've got a lot of unemployment, it means we don't have enough employment. If we have a low level of unemployment, it means we have a pretty high level of employment. Let's focus our energy on understanding what determines the level of employment. The level of employment, he said, depends upon or is determined by the amount of output that's being produced. Remember, output is both goods and services. Both bottles of water and lawyer services and other things like that. That the amount of output that's being produced, that's what determines the demand for labor, which determines how many people have jobs. So then we need to understand what determines the amount of output that's produced. And he said the amount of output that an economy will produce depends upon a concept he called aggregate demand. Aggregate means the sum of everything. So the total demand, the aggregate demand for that output. How much output businesses as a whole, for the economy as a whole, are producing depends upon how much output everybody who's buying output taken together wants to purchase. The amount that firms produce depends upon what they can sell. The takeaway from this, the key idea, the thing that's up here in red, is that someone will hire you if they can sell what you produce. It doesn't say that employment depends upon politics. It doesn't say employment depends upon wages. It doesn't say employment depends upon how patriotic people are. It says employment depends upon how much output is produced, and how much output is produced depends upon what the demand is for output. The takeaway from that is you get a job if the firm that's hiring you believes they can sell what you produce. If they don't think they can sell what you produce, they're not going to offer you a job. People don't give you jobs out of the goodness of their heart. They give you jobs because they want to maximize profit. And they're going to maximize profit by selling what you produce. If they don't think there's a market for what you produce, if they don't think they can sell what you produce, you won't have a job. Now, the other topic of macro I said is inflation. We're not going to talk about inflation until right around Thanksgiving. We come back to this the day before Thanksgiving. The Phillips curve is a notion that we're going to use to talk about inflation. So for those of you who had economics in high school and you did an ASAD model, chuck it. We're not doing an ASAD model. It's not a good way to understand the economy. So we're going to come back. We're going to talk about this in a couple of months. Well, I guess that's only a month and a half. And we're going to talk about how prices and inflation depend upon the cost of production. And those costs of production depend upon the supply and the demand for inputs. And the supply and the demand for inputs depend upon three things. Depend upon the expectations of prices. Do I think that prices are going up in the future by a lot, by a little, not at all? Depend upon the productivity of inputs. Are my workers really productive? Are they not so productive? Are they not? That's the only two choices. And depends upon the amount of output being produced. Now, I'm not going to explain that slide today because we're going to come back to that on the day before Thanksgiving. So when we talk about inflation, we're going to do it with that model, the Phillips curve model, and we're going to talk about inflation as depending primarily upon the cost of production. Between now and Thanksgiving, we're going to focus on the unemployment question and those links from unemployment to employment to output to aggregate demand. So output is measured with the concept of gross domestic product. Employment depends upon how much output is produced, and our measure of how much output is produced is called gross domestic product, or GDP. One definition of GDP is that GDP is the total annual economic output in a nation. Total annual economic output in a nation. Oh my gosh, I'm like flying through my notes here. Where am I? Oh, there we are. So let me unpack that phrase piece by piece. When we say output, we're talking about only final goods and services. Only the final goods and services. Remember, GNS is my shorthand for goods and services. Only final goods and services. We're not going to include intermediate goods or services. We're not going to include raw materials, and we're not going to include used, which is to say previously produced goods. When we're no, postpone. Ah! If that comes up again, make sure I see it fast because I have like only 10 seconds to click postpone. Got my heart racing here. Okay, where was I? Final goods and services. We're not including intermediate goods and services. So if we are looking at a loaf of bread that's purchased by a consumer, assuming the consumer is just buying it to make sandwiches at home, that's a final good or service. If instead that loaf of bread is being purchased by a deli, and the deli's going to make a sandwich and sell you the sandwich, then the loaf of bread is an intermediate